The sun rose over the Shat al-Arab waterway, casting a golden glow on the mudflats and stretching deserts. At the heart of this harsh landscape stood the Abadan oil refinery. To a casual observer, it was a maze of steel pipes, towering smokestacks, and massive storage tanks. But to Britain, this sprawling industrial complex was more than metal and machinery. It was the lifeline of a struggling empire. Spanning over a square mile of desert, the Abadan refinery processed 25 million tons of crude oil every year, making it the largest oil refinery in the world. Every drop of oil, every dollar earned, flowed directly to London, supporting a nation still recovering from the Second World War. Inside the British compound, life seemed like a piece of England transported to the desert. British administrators lived in air-conditioned bungalows with manicured lawns, tennis courts, and swimming pools. Cricket matches were held every Sunday. Fresh food was shipped from London weekly. Sir William Fraser, the chairman of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, often strolled through the lawns with a cigar in hand, speaking to his aides. Without Abadan, Britain is finished. Our navy, our factories, our economy, all of it depends on this refinery, he said. His confidence was unshakable, yet he remained blind to the resentment building just beyond the fences. Outside the compound, Iranian workers lived in shanty towns made from scrap metal and flattened oil drums. There was no running water, no electricity, and the sun beat down mercilessly, often pushing temperatures above 120 degrees Fahrenheit. They worked 12-hour shifts for a pittance, maintaining machinery, cleaning tanks, and operating pumps that produced the wealth flowing to London. A young worker named Hassan wiped sweat from his brow and muttered to a friend, "We carry their wealth every day, and in our own country, we are ghosts. They do not see us. They do not care." The profits of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company were staggering. In 1950 alone, the company made £170 million in profit. The Iranian government received less than £16 million in royalties, while Britain collected more in taxes than Iran did from its own natural resource. For decades, Iranians simmered with resentment, watching as their wealth enriched foreign coffers while they endured poverty and humiliation. In this tense environment, one man rose as a symbol of Iranian dignity and resistance: Mohammad Mossadegh. Frail and often prone to fainting, he was nevertheless a brilliant strategist and an eloquent orator. A lawyer and an aristocrat, Mossadegh was a nationalist who believed that Iran's resources belonged to its people. British diplomats often mocked him, calling him eccentric or unstable, ridiculing his appearance, even his long nose. But Mossadegh was far more than his critics realized. He understood the moral authority that came from justice and the power of standing firm. In the Iranian parliament, Mossadegh delivered a speech that electrified the nation. "The oil under our soil is not for distant shareholders in London," he said. "It is the gift of God to the Iranian people. It is our birthright. We demand control over our resources and a fair division of profits, 50-50, just as American companies have done with Saudi Arabia." Applause filled the chamber. Some members wept openly, moved by the clarity and courage of his words. Mossadegh's demands were revolutionary. The British, led by Fraser, dismissed him as naive. Fraser believed that Iranians could not manage the refinery and that any concession would show weakness. "They will back down," Fraser said confidently to his board. "They need our engineers. Without us, the refinery cannot function." Yet he underestimated the rising tide of Iranian nationalism and the moral weight Mossadegh carried. By March 1951, the Iranian parliament voted unanimously to nationalize the oil industry. Weeks later, Mossadegh was elected prime minister. London was thrown into shock. A third-world nation had seized one of the greatest assets of the British crown. In cabinet meetings at 10 Downing Street, ministers debated furiously. Some argued for military action. Others, aware of Britain's financial weakness, urged caution. The loss of Abadan was not just a financial issue. It was a blow to Britain's pride and global status. Britain's post-war economy was fragile. Debt to the United States was enormous. Citizens lived on rationed food, wearing patched clothing, their standard of living sharply reduced. Operation Buccaneer, the proposed invasion of Abadan, was theoretically feasible but financially impossible. American support was unlikely, as the United States was focused on the Korean War and wary of antagonizing the Muslim world. Faced with these constraints, Britain resorted to economic warfare. The Royal Navy blockaded Iranian oil exports. Iranian assets and British banks were frozen. Exports of essential materials, including steel and sugar, were halted. British engineers left Abadan, leaving the refinery silent and the people uncertain. Mossadegh remained resolute. "We will endure these hardships," he told his ministers in private meetings. "Freedom is worth more than wealth. Iran's dignity cannot be bought or stolen." The people responded. Bonds were issued to fund internal economic activity. Communities rallied to support one another. National unity strengthened, despite the blockade. Mossadegh became a hero not only in Iran, but across the developing world, a man standing against imperial power. Churchill, returning to office in 1951, seethed. The loss of Abadan was personal and strategic. The man in pajamas defying the empire was an affront to his pride. Military intervention was out of reach. Economic pressure alone was not enough. Churchill realized he needed a new weapon: espionage. MI6 began planning Operation Boot, a covert operation to overthrow Mossadegh. Bribes, propaganda, and secret alliances would replace the failed tactics of armies and blockades. The objective was to create chaos, weaken Mossadegh's authority, and install a government friendly to British interests. Meanwhile, the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, remained indecisive. Young, inexperienced, and aware of Mossadegh's popularity, he hesitated to act without clear foreign backing. This hesitation would later prove critical. The stage was set. Mossadegh stood firm. The people rallied. Britain plotted in the shadows, and the Iranian nation prepared to face a storm of history. By the spring of 1951, the mood in Tehran was electric. The streets buzzed with whispers of change. Vendors shouted their wares, and the air carried the scent of fresh bread and strong tea. Yet beneath this ordinary bustle, a revolution was quietly stirring. The Iranian parliament had voted to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, transferring control of the nation's most valuable resource from London to Tehran. For ordinary Iranians, this was more than a legal shift. It was a reclaiming of dignity, a declaration that their land and its wealth belonged to them, not to distant powers. Mossadegh, frail yet commanding, moved steadily through Tehran. Even in his worn pajamas, he exuded authority. He visited schools, factories, and bazaars, speaking with citizens directly. "We will endure," he told a group of local shopkeepers, "because freedom is worth every sacrifice. Our oil belongs to Iran, and we will never give it away again." Children followed him through the streets, waving small banners that read, "Iranian oil for Iran," while adults nodded in quiet approval, seeing in him a leader who carried their hopes. Inside Parliament, Mossadegh's speeches resonated with moral clarity. He argued for fairness and national sovereignty, citing examples from Saudi Arabia where American oil companies had negotiated equitable profit-sharing agreements. "Our people are not servants of foreign shareholders," he declared. "The oil under our soil is a gift from God, not a dividend for London. The books must be opened. The profits must be shared fairly." Each word carried weight, echoing beyond the gilded walls into the streets, into homes, and into the hearts of millions. Meanwhile, across the Persian Gulf, the British Empire reeled from the news. Sir William Fraser convened an emergency board meeting in London. "This is an outrage," he said, slamming his fist on the table. "Abadan cannot function without our engineers. The Iranians cannot run this refinery. They will fail, and we cannot let it stand." His colleagues nodded, but reality tempered their outrage. Britain's economy was fragile, the treasury was nearly empty, and the United States offered no guarantee of support. Military intervention was financially impossible. Economic pressure seemed the only viable tool. The streets of Tehran soon became a theater of hope and tension. Citizens celebrated cautiously, sharing tea and bread in small gatherings, while murmurs of British retaliation circulated. Mossadegh's government, aware of the challenges, issued bonds to raise domestic funds and stabilize the economy. Communities organized themselves to endure shortages, sharing resources and supporting one another. In mosques and tea houses, discussions centered on sovereignty, fairness, and the price of independence. Mossadegh's presence provided a moral anchor. His steadfastness reassured a nervous populace that the struggle was worth enduring. British officials began a campaign of economic pressure. The Royal Navy patrolled the Persian Gulf, turning away tankers attempting to purchase Iranian oil. Assets held in British banks were frozen, and essential exports like steel and sugar were halted. British engineers departed Abadan, leaving the refinery silent. London hoped that economic hardship would break Mossadegh's government, force him to compromise, or trigger a popular uprising against him. Yet the strategy underestimated the Iranian people's resilience and the depth of national unity that Mossadegh had cultivated. Inside Mossadegh's office, he addressed his ministers with calm authority. "They believe they can starve us into submission. he said. We will endure, but we will not yield. This is a fight for dignity, for sovereignty. Bonds will be issued, resources managed carefully, and the people will be our strength. His ministers, though anxious about the economic blockade, felt inspired by his confidence. Every decision was calculated to preserve national pride while maintaining essential services. The Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, watched events with growing unease. Young, inexperienced, and aware of Mossadegh's popularity, he hesitated to act decisively. His indecision became a key factor in the unfolding drama. Every advisor offered conflicting advice, yet he feared that taking sides prematurely could cost him his throne. In private moments, he expressed frustration and fear. This man in pajamas, he muttered, has captured the loyalty of the nation. If I move too soon, I risk everything. As months passed, the tension between Britain and Iran deepened. British diplomats circulated propaganda suggesting Mossadegh was weak, corrupt, or even sympathetic to communism. Yet Mossadegh remained vigilant. In meetings with journalists, military contacts, and community leaders, he emphasized unity and truth. Do not be swayed by lies, he said. Our cause is just, and our people know it. The empire will try to intimidate us, but we will not falter. His calm authority and clarity of purpose reinforced his position as both political and moral leader. Meanwhile, Britain faced internal divisions. Churchill, now in power, was furious. The loss of Abadan was not just financial, it was a personal affront. Yet he could not act openly. Britain's coffers were empty, its military overstretched, and American support uncertain. The solution became clear: espionage. MI6 began planning Operation Boot, a covert mission to destabilize Mossadegh's government. Agents contacted generals, journalists, clerics, and gang leaders, offering bribes and promises of power. The goal was simple: create chaos, undermine Mossadegh's authority, and prepare the way for a government favorable to British interests. At the same time, Tehran citizens felt the growing tension. Rumors of spies, secret meetings, and foreign interference circulated quietly in markets and tea houses. Mossadegh, aware of these threats, maintained communication with loyalists in the military and local communities. Their tactics are subtle, he warned his advisors. They will attempt to buy our people, to turn brother against brother. We must remain vigilant and united. By the end of 1952, the stage was set. Mossadegh commanded the loyalty of the people, guided the country through sanctions, and maintained a moral authority that inspired nations beyond Iran. Britain, frustrated and desperate, turned increasingly to covert operations, setting the stage for the involvement of the CIA and the infamous Operation Ajax. The struggle over Iranian oil had evolved from a legal and economic dispute into a high-stakes geopolitical chess game. The consequences would reverberate across decades, shaping the Middle East and altering global power dynamics forever. By late 1952, Britain's efforts to regain control of Iranian oil had reached a dead end. The economic blockade had slowed trade, but had failed to break the Iranian spirit. Abadan Refinery remained silent, yet Mossadegh's influence only grew. Winston Churchill, frustrated and determined, realized that Britain could not act alone. The nation lacked the funds, and the United States, focused on the Korean War, was unwilling to provide direct military support. Churchill's solution was bold. He would use the United States to do what Britain could not. He framed the situation not as a financial dispute over oil, but as a threat of communist expansion. In meetings with President Dwight D. Eisenhower's team, he warned of Iran sliding into chaos and communism. If Mossadegh remains, if the economy collapses, the communists will take control, Churchill said. The Soviets will dominate the Persian Gulf, the oil, and the security of the West. The Dulles brothers, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and CIA Director Allen Dulles, saw the world in stark, black and white terms. Communism was the ultimate enemy. The British framing of Mossadegh as weak and potentially sympathetic to communists appealed to their strategic instincts. Whether or not it was true mattered little. Containing perceived communist influence was a national priority, and Britain's intelligence offered a convenient path. A joint operation was quickly devised. The CIA would take the lead, while MI6 provided intelligence, contacts, and local support. The mission was codenamed Operation Ajax, a plan to remove Mossadegh and install a government friendly to Western interests. The budget was modest by modern standards, just $1 million. Yet this small sum would fuel a complex, multi-layered coup, leveraging money, influence, and fear to reshape a nation. Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, was chosen to run the operation on the ground. Handsome, disciplined, and skilled in espionage, he was ideal for the delicate task ahead. In the summer of 1953, Roosevelt crossed into Iran from Iraq with nothing but a suitcase full of cash. Inside were stacks of Iranian rials and American dollars, the currency that will buy loyalty, bribe officials, and create the appearance of popular uprising. Tehran, already tense from sanctions and economic instability, was fertile ground for manipulation. Inflation had skyrocketed, the middle class struggled to survive, and ordinary citizens were increasingly anxious. Mossadegh's early popularity was beginning to crack under the strain of food shortages and unemployment. Roosevelt knew the city's pressure points: the streets, the press, the army, and religious leaders. Every corner of Tehran offered an opportunity to shape events. Roosevelt's first move was the press. Editors and columnists received envelopes of cash, along with instructions on how to frame Mossadegh. Newspapers overnight transformed into weapons of propaganda, accusing Mossadegh of atheism, communism, and collusion with foreign powers. Contradictions did not matter. Confusion was the strategy. Citizens, waking each morning to a barrage of alarming headlines, were forced to question their leader and his intentions. Next came the streets. Roosevelt recruited local gang leaders, known as the Zircon, men respected and feared in Tehran neighborhoods. These musclemen organized mobs to clash in carefully orchestrated violence. One mob would shout, "Long live Mossadegh," while attacking another chanting, "Long live the Shah." The city became a theater of fear. Ordinary citizens, caught between the stage battles, grew increasingly anxious and confused. Key army generals were approached discreetly. MI6 provided intelligence on who could be bribed or persuaded. Clerics, aware of their influence over the population, were quietly co-opted. The goal was to create the appearance of disorder, to make Mossadegh appear isolated and powerless. Every act of violence, every orchestrated protest, was intended to undermine his authority and shift loyalty toward forces sympathetic to the Shah. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was young and hesitant. His indecision was a significant factor in the operation's initial failure. He feared that signing the decrees dismissing Mossadegh without proof of success would leave him vulnerable. To give him confidence, the British devised a signal, a broadcast on BBC Persian at midnight. The announcer would say, "It is now exactly midnight." The Shah would understand this as confirmation of British support, prompting him to sign the necessary decrees appointing General Fazlollah Zahedi as Prime Minister. August 15, 1953, arrived. An officer loyal to the Shah attempted to arrest Mossadegh at his residence. However, Mossadegh had been warned. His Tudeh party network, embedded in the military, had alerted him to the plan. The officer walked into a trap. Mossadegh's loyal guards and armored vehicles surrounded him. The arrest attempt failed spectacularly. Panic swept through the conspirators. The Shah, hearing of the failure, fled the country, first to Baghdad, then to Rome, leaving Tehran in a state of uncertainty. Roosevelt received urgent orders from the CIA to evacuate. "Abort immediately," the telegram read. Most agents would have complied. Roosevelt did not. He saw an opportunity in the chaos. While the military aspect had failed, the psychological campaign, the confusion, fear, and unrest, was still active. Over the next 3 days, Roosevelt poured his suitcase of cash into Tehran, funding gangs, clerics, journalists, and anyone capable of influencing public perception. The streets were flooded with orchestrated demonstrations, attacks on newspapers, and staged chaos. By August 19th, the second wave of the coup began. Massive protests erupted, government buildings were attacked, and mobs roamed freely. Army units that had initially remained neutral switched sides, sensing momentum shifting against Mossadegh. General Zahedi, previously hiding in a CIA safe house, emerged atop a tank, signaling the army's support for the coup. The final confrontation occurred at Mossadegh's home on 109 Cock Street. Tanks fired upon gates while his loyal guards fought back with machine guns and bazookas. Hundreds died in the siege. Finally, with ammunition depleted and the roof collapsing, Mossadegh surrendered. The man in pajamas, who had defied the British Empire and claimed the moral high ground for Iran, was taken into custody. The radio announced, "The government of Mossadegh has been crushed. Long live the Shah." In Rome, the Shah reportedly turned pale, muttering, "I knew they loved me," as he prepared to return to Tehran. In London, Churchill celebrated. Britain had reclaimed its oil, restored the Shah's authority, and demonstrated that the empire could still influence nations covertly. Yet the United States, who had executed the operation, insisted on an international consortium for Iranian oil. Britain retained only 40% of its former monopoly, with the remainder divided among American, Dutch, and French companies. A tactical success had come with a strategic compromise. The coup marked the decline of British dominance and the rise of American influence in the Middle East. The human cost of Operation Ajax was immense. Tehran's streets were filled with bodies. Political leaders were imprisoned, military units purged, and public trust shattered. Mossadegh's arrest created a vacuum in Iranian politics, weakening democratic institutions and setting the stage for decades of authoritarian rule. Yet for Churchill and the British elite, the operation's financial and strategic returns seemed to justify the human and moral costs. After the dramatic events of August 1953, the Shah returned to Tehran, greeted by generals and officials who had played key roles in the coup. The city was tense, the streets scarred from weeks of orchestrated violence. Yet the Shah walked with a sense of triumph. Order is restored, he announced at a military parade, his voice echoing across the crowd. Behind his carefully crafted public image, however, lay a deep insecurity. He owed his throne to foreign powers, not to the loyalty of his people, and that awareness shaped every decision he would make in the years to come. The first challenge for the Shah was consolidating power. Mossadegh's supporters remained in the streets, in parliament, and even within segments of the military. Rumors of resistance circulated quietly, whispered in bazaars and tea houses. In response, the Shah created a formidable secret police force, SAVAK. Trained and advised by the CIA and Israeli Mossad, SAVAK's mandate was simple yet brutal: root out dissent, crush opposition, and maintain absolute loyalty to the Shah. Prisoners were interrogated with methods of psychological and physical torture, while spies infiltrated political groups, student organizations, and religious institutions. Fear became a tool of governance. Despite the climate of terror, the Shah also embarked on ambitious modernization projects. Highways cut across the country, universities were established, and industries were expanded. Oil wealth, now managed by an international consortium, poured into infrastructure and state development. Yet the benefits were uneven. The wealth stayed concentrated among the elite, military leaders, and foreign-aligned businessmen. Ordinary citizens saw little change in their daily lives, especially outside Tehran. Rural communities remained impoverished, their voices unheard, and their grievances ignored. For many Iranians, the events of 1953 were never forgotten. Mossadegh became a symbol of resistance and national pride, even in exile. His arrest and the violent suppression of his government left a bitter legacy. Religious leaders, in particular, carried the memory forward. They told stories of 1953 in mosques across the country, framing it as a lesson of foreign interference and betrayal. These narratives sowed the seeds of a future revolution. One figure, Ayatollah Khomeini, emerged as a leader who would channel that anger decades later. In private, the Shah admitted his own insecurities. "I sit on a throne built by others," he confided to his inner circle. "If I do not assert absolute control, I will lose everything." This paranoia shaped his rule. SAVAK expanded relentlessly, and loyalty to the Shah became a prerequisite for survival. Dissenters, liberals, communists, nationalists, vanished or silenced. Teachers, journalists, and clerics all learned the price of speaking against the regime. The Shah's court grew luxurious, but it was surrounded by fear and suspicion. Internationally, the Shah's Iran became a strategic ally of the United States. Oil flowed reliably to Western markets, military bases were established, and Iran became a critical player in Cold War geopolitics. Yet this alliance came with a cost: the perception that Iran's sovereignty had been compromised. To many citizens, the Shah was not a national leader, but a puppet, installed and maintained by foreign powers. This perception fueled resentment, particularly among students, intellectuals, and the religious community. By the 1960s, Iran's social and economic policies created stark contrasts. In Tehran, modern apartment buildings, shopping centers, and paved streets reflected the oil wealth. Elsewhere, villages lacked clean water, schools were underfunded, and access to healthcare was limited. This inequality deepened social tensions. The Shah, aware of his reliance on foreign support, ignored these growing inequalities, believing that loyalty from the elite and military would secure his rule. Meanwhile, SAVAK continued to monitor every corner of society. Letters were opened, phone calls were intercepted, and spies were planted in schools and workplaces. Even casual conversations could lead to arrest or imprisonment. The climate of fear extended to religious institutions, which had previously served as centers of social cohesion and political discussion. Clerics adapted, using sermons to subtly criticize the regime, keeping the memory of Mossadegh and the 1953 coup alive among the faithful. By the 1970s, resentment had become a quiet but powerful undercurrent. Students, intellectuals, and activists began organizing underground movements, inspired by both Mossadegh's nationalism and growing frustration with economic inequality and political repression. Demonstrations were often met with brutal force. Yet each act of repression strengthened the perception that the Shah was a tyrant whose power rested on fear and foreign support. One of the most lasting consequences of a 1953 coup was the lesson it left for the Iranian people. Democratic change was fragile when challenged by foreign powers. Mossadegh had been a constitutional nationalist, seeking to strengthen Iran's parliamentary democracy while controlling its natural resources. By removing him violently, the West signaled that foreign interests trumped domestic choice. Future generations absorbed this lesson. If democracy could be overturned for the sake of oil, the path of resistance might shift to other, more radical arenas, the mosques, the streets, and eventually, the revolutionary movement itself. Ayatollah Khomeini emerged as the figurehead of this new opposition. In exile, he studied, organized, and cultivated a narrative that framed the United States and Britain as the architects of Iran's suffering. The story of Mossadegh's overthrow, the chaos in Tehran, and the foreign-directed installation of the Shah became central to his message. Khomeini's speeches and writings, filled with historical references and moral urgency, resonated deeply with students, workers, and religious communities. By the late 1970s, his influence had become irresistible. The revolution of 1979 was, in many ways, a delayed reckoning for the events of 1953. Students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking 52 American diplomats hostage. They were not merely protesting the Shah's regime or his corruption. They were refighting the coup of 1953, confronting the CIA, and reclaiming a sense of national dignity that had been violated decades earlier. The Iranian Revolution reshaped global geopolitics, dismantling U.S. and British influence in the country, and establishing a new theocratic government that would challenge the West for generations. In London and Washington, the long-term consequences were sobering. Britain's attempts to protect its oil monopoly had succeeded in the short term, but it had permanently damaged its reputation in the Middle East. The United States had secured access to Iranian oil, yet it had also planted the seeds of anti-American sentiment that would erupt in crisis and hostility. The events of 1953 demonstrated that tactical success could be a strategic disaster. A small investment, $1 million in cash, had produced enormous, unforeseen consequences that reverberated for decades. The story of the Shah, Savak, and the long-term consequences of Operation Ajax serves as a cautionary tale. It illustrates how foreign intervention, even when justified as protecting economic interests or fighting communism, can undermine democracy, radicalize populations, and sow resentment that lasts for generations. Mossadegh's arrest, the installation of a puppet regime, and the brutal suppression of dissent created a legacy of fear, distrust, and revolutionary fervor that transformed Iran and reshaped the Middle East. By 1979, decades of political repression, economic inequality, and foreign interference erupted into a full-scale revolution. Tehran was unrecognizable. Streets once filled with orderly traffic now teemed with massive crowds waving banners, chanting slogans, and demanding the end of the Shah's rule. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and fear, yet it carried a powerful sense of hope and inevitability. For many, this was a chance to reclaim dignity, sovereignty, and the promise of a country that could finally govern itself without foreign interference. Ayatollah Khomeini, returning from exile in Paris, became the symbolic and strategic leader of the revolution. His speeches, broadcast across the country, called for the overthrow of the Shah and the establishment of an Islamic government. Iran belongs to the Iranian people, he declared. The age of puppets and foreign masters is over. We will not bow to the West. We will govern ourselves with justice and faith. Citizens, students, and clerics rallied behind him, inspired by the vision of independence and moral governance. The Shah's regime, despite decades of modernization and wealth accumulation, crumbled quickly. Even the army, once loyal, faced divided loyalties. Officers feared both the strength of revolutionary fervor and the moral weight of suppressing their own citizens. Demonstrations swelled daily, from Tehran to small towns and rural villages. SAVAK, the feared secret police, attempted to crush dissent, but the scale of the uprising was unprecedented. Ordinary citizens, students, and religious leaders acted in unison, creating an unstoppable wave of resistance. Inside the Shah's palace, tension was palpable. Advisors argued desperately for concessions, reforms, or even exile. The Shah, aware that his throne rested on foreign support and not on popular loyalty, wavered. In private conversations, he admitted, "The country is no longer mine to command. Even my army hesitates. We cannot hold Tehran against the will of the people." Within weeks, he fled Iran, first to Egypt and eventually to the United States for medical treatment, leaving a vacuum that would forever alter the nation's trajectory. As Khomeini returned, the revolution shifted from protest to governance. A new theocratic system was established, blending Islamic law with political authority. Clerics assumed key positions of power and the ideals of Mossadegh: national sovereignty, control over resources, and resistance to foreign dominance, merged with religious authority to create a powerful and enduring political ideology. The revolution redefined Iran's identity on both a domestic and international stage. The United States and Britain, who had orchestrated or supported earlier interventions, were blindsided. Their former ally, the Shah, was gone, and the new regime quickly asserted independence. Hostilities escalated in dramatic fashion. In November 1979, students seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking 52 Americans hostage. They were not merely reacting to the Shah's past abuses. They were confronting the CIA and British involvement in 1953. The hostage crisis became a symbolic continuation of the struggle over national dignity, sovereignty, and the consequences of foreign manipulation. The international community watched with alarm. Oil markets, already volatile, faced uncertainty as Iran's political system shifted dramatically. Western governments scrambled to negotiate, impose sanctions, and safeguard their strategic interests. The United States, in particular, realized that decades of covert operations, interventions, and support for authoritarian rule had created deep-seated resentment. The Middle East, a region historically dominated by European powers, had become a theater where American influence was both essential and contested. Domestically, Iran underwent a transformation. Land reform, nationalization of industries, and social programs aimed to redistribute wealth and improve education. Yet the revolution also brought authoritarian elements. Khomeini and his successors exercised strict control over political opposition. The lessons of 1953 were clear. Foreign powers would not hesitate to intervene, so internal unity and ideological conformity became central to governance. SAVAK's replacement, revolutionary committees, and security forces maintained internal control, ensuring that dissent was limited and that the memory of foreign betrayal remained a potent political tool. Over the decades, the legacy of the 1953 coup and the 1979 revolution has influenced generations of Iranians. Political activism, student movements, and religious organizations all trace their roots to the events set in motion by Operation Ajax. The perception that democracy can be undermined by external forces shifted opposition from parliamentary politics to religious and revolutionary avenues. Mossadegh's martyrdom became a moral and political touchstone, celebrated in schools, mosques, and public discourse as a symbol of resistance. Internationally, Iran's transformation altered global dynamics. Relations with the United States and Britain became strained, with decades of mistrust shaping diplomacy, trade, and military strategy. Regional conflicts, including the Iran-Iraq War, were influenced by the historical memory of foreign interference and the desire to assert independence. The Islamic Republic became both a regional power and a counterweight to Western influence, guided by lessons learned from the events of 1953 and the Shah's authoritarian misrule. Economically, the revolution reshaped Iran's oil industry. Nationalization and control over resources ensured that foreign corporations could no longer dominate profits as they had under the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company or the 1954 Consortium. While global sanctions, mismanagement, and political instability challenged growth, Iran retained sovereignty over its primary resource. The symbolic victory of controlling oil, combined with the moral victory of resisting foreign intervention, solidified the revolution's ideological power. The lessons of history remain stark. The 1953 coup, Operation Ajax, and subsequent Western support for the Shah's dictatorship had short-term financial and strategic benefits for Britain and the United States. Yet these actions created deep-seated resentment, radicalized populations, and undermined democratic institutions. Iran's modern trajectory, from revolution to global influence and regional conflict, cannot be understood without reference to these pivotal events. Today, the memory of 1953 and 1979 resonates in political discourse, international relations, and cultural identity. Iranians remember Mossadegh as a hero of national sovereignty and independence, a man who dared challenge global empires. They remember Khomeini as the leader who reclaimed dignity, and they recount the Shah's rule as a cautionary tale of authoritarianism supported by foreign powers. For historians, political analysts, and citizens worldwide, Iran's story serves as a testament to the long-term consequences of intervention, the power of national identity, and the enduring importance of sovereignty. The story of Iran from 1951 to 1979 is not just a tale of oil, politics, and power. It is a story about the long shadow of foreign intervention, the fragility of democracy, and the unintended consequences of short-term decisions. From the Abadan refinery to the streets of Tehran during the revolution, the decisions made by British and American governments reshaped a nation, and in many ways, the entire Middle East. In 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh had a simple, yet profound argument. The oil under Iranian soil belonged to the Iranian people. For decades, Britain had treated Iran as a resource colony, extracting profits while the Iranian population endured poverty, poor working conditions, and inequality. Mossadegh was not a radical. He was a constitutional nationalist, a man who believed in transparency, fairness, and sovereignty. His nationalization of the oil industry was a bold assertion of dignity and a declaration that Iran would control its own destiny. The British reaction to Mossadegh's assertion revealed the priorities of empire. They were not concerned about the well-being of the Iranian people or the principles of justice. They were concerned about revenue, prestige, and the symbolic power of the empire. When economic sanctions failed to coerce Iran and military intervention was deemed too costly, Britain turned to espionage and covert operations. Operation Boot, which later became Operation Ajax with CIA involvement, was designed to achieve one goal: remove Mossadegh and reinstall a government aligned with Western interests. Kermit Roosevelt Jr.'s role in Tehran was the epitome of modern covert intervention. With a suitcase of cash, bribed clerics, gang leaders, journalists, and army generals, he orchestrated a fake revolution to manufacture chaos and fear. The operation was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Streets filled with orchestrated mobs, newspapers spewed propaganda, and neutral army units switched sides under perceived pressure. The goal was clear: make Mossadegh appear isolated, impotent, and illegitimate. Yet, the immediate success of Operation Ajax came with moral and political costs that would echo for decades. Mossadegh's arrest and the Shah's installation created a precedent that foreign powers could manipulate, coerce, and even remove democratically elected leaders to protect economic or strategic interests. For the Iranian people, democracy had failed. The ballot box had been overturned, and the lesson was harsh. Resistance to foreign influence, even through legal and constitutional means, could be crushed by money, propaganda, and covert power. The Shah's return marked the beginning of a new era of authoritarianism. Though he modernized infrastructure, universities, and industry, the wealth and power were concentrated at the top. Ordinary citizens, particularly in rural areas, saw little improvement in living conditions. SAVAK, the secret police trained by the CIA, maintained strict control through fear, surveillance, and brutal suppression of dissent. The Shah's dependence on foreign support reinforced a narrative of illegitimacy. The monarchy ruled because of outsiders, not because of domestic loyalty. This combination of repression, inequality, and memory of the 1953 coup created the conditions for the Iranian Revolution of 1979. The revolution was not only a rejection of the Shah's dictatorship, but also a direct response to decades of foreign interference. Students, clerics, and ordinary citizens united to reclaim their nation. Ayatollah Khomeini became the symbolic leader, framing the revolution as a moral and nationalistic struggle against foreign dominance. The hostage crisis, the expulsion of the Shah, and the establishment of the Islamic Republic were direct consequences of the events set in motion by the 1953 coup. Globally, the consequences were profound. For Britain, the coup secured short-term oil profits and a temporary return to influence, but it marked the beginning of the end of its Middle East dominance. America, initially focused on containing communism, found itself facing a long-term adversary. The Islamic Republic of Iran became both a strategic challenger and a symbol of resistance to Western intervention. The Middle East, already a complex geopolitical landscape, was reshaped by decades of foreign meddling, covert operations, and the eventual backlash against perceived exploitation. Operation Ajax also offers important lessons in the limits of power. Tactical victories can be strategically short-sighted. A $1 million investment created immediate returns in oil and political control, yet it planted seeds of anti-Western sentiment that transformed Iran into a long-term adversary. The operation illustrates how manipulation of domestic politics for financial or geopolitical gain can produce outcomes far beyond the initial intentions. The coup demonstrates the dangers of undervaluing national dignity, popular legitimacy, and cultural identity. The moral implications are equally significant. For all the planning, intelligence, and logistical genius involved in the coup, the human cost was immense. Hundreds died during orchestrated street battles. Political leaders were imprisoned or exiled. Democratic institutions were weakened. The psychological scars endured for generations, fueling mistrust of foreign powers and shaping Iranian political consciousness. Mossadegh's legacy became one of martyrdom, illustrating the profound human consequences when democracy is undermined by external forces. From a modern perspective, the story of Iran between 1951 and 1979 remains a cautionary tale. It underscores the importance of respecting sovereignty, understanding cultural and historical context, and recognizing the unintended consequences of foreign intervention. It also demonstrates the interconnectedness of global politics, economics, and human rights. Decisions made for short-term gain, whether financial, strategic, or political, can ripple across decades, affecting millions of lives and reshaping regional and global dynamics. The enduring legacy of these events is evident in contemporary Iranian politics and international relations. The memory of the 1953 coup informs Iran's skepticism toward the West, particularly the United States and Britain. Anti-interventionist narratives dominate political discourse. The revolution of 1979, the hostage crisis, and subsequent conflicts are directly tied to the historical memory of foreign manipulation. For historians, political analysts, and policymakers, the lessons are clear. Respect for sovereignty and the rule of law is not just ethical, it is pragmatic. Finally, the story of Iran highlights a broader lesson about the costs of empire and greed. Britain's desire to maintain oil profits, combined with the United States' strategic ambitions during the Cold War, created a short-term victory at a long-term cost. Mossadegh's vision of Iranian sovereignty, the Shah's authoritarian misrule, and the eventual revolution form a historical continuum. They reveal the human, political, and cultural consequences of decisions made in distant capitals, driven by profit, paranoia, or ideology. As viewers and students of history, understanding this story is crucial. It is a tale of ambition, pride, power, and consequence, a reminder that history is shaped not only by grand strategies and military operations, but by the choices of individuals and nations, and their respect or disregard for the dignity of others. Iran's past informs its present, and its lessons resonate for policymakers, historians, and citizens around the world. So, if you want to stay ahead of global history, understand the hidden forces behind modern geopolitics, and see how past decisions continue to shape our world today, make sure to like, subscribe, and join our community. We dive deep into history, uncovering the truths that shape nations and the stories that mainstream history books often overlook. Don't miss out. Your journey through history starts here.